A force that opposed you lost its position. Not long ago, that resistance stopped advancing and withdrew. This was witnessed by higher authority and by the opposition itself. No intervention occurred, no assistance was given. The moment was observed and recorded as it happened. This is not symbolic, this is not motivational, this is not poetic. You remember the moment you chose restraint instead of reaction. You remember when silence replaced retaliation. You remember when you held your ground without announcing it. That decision locked the outcome in place. In this video, we will explain what shifted, why the opposition could no longer proceed, and what consequences were immediately set in motion as a result of that withdrawal. What follows is not optional. Recognition triggered sequence, and sequence now produces outcome. Subscribe to remain aligned with these confirmations and maintain access as this unfolds. The first shift occurred at the exact point where opposition applied pressure and failed to advance. What was meant to provoke reaction instead met restraint. What was intended to extract energy produced no movement. The resistance did not end because you pushed back. It ended because there was nothing left for it to push against. That absence of engagement altered the structure of the confrontation immediately. Pressure increased before it collapsed. The opposing force intensified its presence, repeated its approach, and attempted to provoke response through familiar channels. Each attempt returned no usable result. Instead of gaining ground, the force lost position. The effort required to maintain pressure exceeded the return it was receiving. At that moment, resistance became unsustainable. This is where reversal was registered, not as a feeling, not as relief, but as a structural failure on the opposing side. The force recognized that continuation would result in further loss rather than gain. Advancement stopped. Retraction followed. The step back was not strategic patience. It was containment of damage already incurred. From that point forward, the situation could no longer return to its previous state. The opposition had revealed its limit and reached it. The balance shifted without confrontation, without declaration, and without visible struggle. This is the moment the field changed permanently, making every development that follows unavoidable. The second confirmation occurred when the moment was observed without interruption. Higher authority did not interfere, redirect, or soften the exchange. Observation alone was sufficient. The event did not require correction because it met an existing standard. What unfolded aligned with an already established order, and that alignment was noted immediately. This observation was not delayed. It did not wait for explanation or justification. The instant resistance failed and withdrew, acknowledgment followed, not as approval and not as reward, but as recognition that a boundary had been enforced without instruction. That is what elevated the moment from conflict to record. Opposition was aware of being witnessed. This awareness altered its behavior more than any confrontation could have. When a force realizes its actions are fully seen and still produce no leverage, retreat becomes the only viable option. Intervention was unnecessary because exposure itself was sufficient pressure. From that point forward, the situation carried authority beyond personal effort. What had been private resistance became an acknowledged event. Once witnessed, it could not be dismissed, revised, or reversed. This acknowledgement fixed the moment in place and ensured that everything unfolding next would proceed under a different jurisdiction entirely. The third shift occurred when past decisions became active factors rather than background history. Choices you made earlier, without audience and without reinforcement, moved from dormant to decisive. These were not emotional decisions, they were structural ones. Each time you refused to compromise integrity for relief, a position was fixed. Each time you chose restraint over immediate advantage, leverage was removed from the opposition without announcement. Those decisions did not produce visible results at the time. They were not meant to. Their function was delayed. They existed as locked variables, waiting for pressure to expose their effect. When resistance intensified, those prior choices determined the outcome automatically. The opposition did not face a new response. It collided with a completed framework it could no longer alter. This is why the reversal appeared sudden. It was not created in the moment. It was triggered by it. The force opposing you reached backward, searching for earlier access points, previous openings, unfinished reactions. None were available. Every prior decision had already closed those routes. What looked like restraint was actually removal of options. At that point, the situation shifted from confrontation to inevitability. The outcome no longer depended on what you would do next. It was governed by what had already been done. This is where movement became one-directional. Once past decisions activated, the structure could not be renegotiated, and the path forward became fixed. The fourth shift occurred when access was lost. The opposing force no longer reached the same internal points it once influenced. Channels that previously responded went inactive without resistance. Emotional entry points closed. Mental hooks stopped registering. What had been familiar pathways suddenly produced no response, not because they were defended, but because they were no longer connected. This loss of access was not gradual. It happened as a result of the earlier structural changes locking into place. Once restraint, integrity, and silence became permanent positions, the opposition found nothing to attach to. Attempts to re-enter followed old patterns and received no return. Influence requires response. Without it, control collapses. The opposing force recognized this loss immediately. Repetition did not restore access. Escalation did not reopen channels. What had once been reactive terrain became neutral ground. The absence of engagement confirmed that authority had shifted internally and could no longer be bypassed. From this point forward, interference was no longer possible in the same way. The opposition was forced to operate without leverage, without familiarity, and without entry. That condition made every following attempt weaker by default and ensured that any future pressure would expose limitation rather than create movement. The fifth shift occurred when escalation failed to recover control. After access was lost, pressure did not decrease. It intensified. The opposition increased frequency, urgency, and force, attempting to recreate an earlier dynamic through volume rather than precision. What once required minimal effort now demanded sustained output, and even that produced no return. Escalation became visible not as strength, but as strain. Each attempt followed a familiar sequence, and each sequence collapsed faster than the last. The opposition relied on repetition, assuming persistence would eventually trigger response. Instead, repetition exposed limitation. The more pressure applied, the clearer it became that nothing was moving. Escalation stopped functioning as a tactic and began functioning as evidence of failure. This is where dominance reversed definitively. When effort increases while effectiveness declines, authority has already shifted. The opposition was no longer applying pressure from advantage. It was compensating for loss. What appeared aggressive was actually reactive. What looked intense was unsustainable. The imbalance became measurable. At that point, escalation could no longer continue without causing further loss. Every additional attempt reinforced the same conclusion. Control was gone. Pressure no longer shaped outcomes. It only confirmed that the situation had passed beyond influence. From here forward, resistance would only reveal weakness, making the next phase unavoidable. The sixth shift occurred when immunity became evident. The opposition did not encounter resistance. It encountered non-reaction. Emotional signals that once triggered internal movement produced nothing. Mental prompts that previously demanded attention passed without registration. This was not discipline being applied in the moment. This was a condition already established. The internal environment had changed before the opposition noticed. This immunity was not learned under pressure. It activated because the structures supporting reaction were no longer present. What had once been accessible was no longer available for use. The opposition attempted to stimulate urgency, doubt, and internal noise, but each attempt fell into empty space. There was no feedback loop to exploit. Without response, influence had nowhere to operate. The opposition recognized this immunity as final. Immunity does not negotiate. It does not escalate. It simply nullifies. Every effort to provoke exposed the same result. No shift, no engagement, no entry. What had once been reactive terrain became inert. This marked the moment when opposition tactics stopped being applicable entirely. From this point forward, the balance could not swing back. Immunity removed the need for defense and rendered pressure irrelevant. The situation moved out of contest and into containment. What followed was no longer about confrontation, but about acknowledgement that a critical threshold had already been crossed. The seventh shift occurred when interference ceased without explanation. The absence was immediate and unmistakable. What had been constant noise, pressure, or obstruction stopped appearing. There was no transition period and no final attempt. Silence replaced activity, not as a pause, but as a result. This silence did not signal patience. It signaled withdrawal after failure. Silence carries weight only when force has exhausted its options. In this case, silence confirmed that every available approach had already been tested and found ineffective. The opposition did not step back to wait. It stepped back because there was nothing left to apply. Continued presence would have produced further exposure of limitation. Withdrawal preserved what little position remained. This silence was observed and registered as confirmation. It marked the point where opposition no longer dictated timing, rhythm, or engagement. Control had shifted fully, and the absence of interference became the clearest indicator. When pressure disappears without resolution, it means resolution already occurred elsewhere. From that moment forward, the environment stabilized under a new condition. The lack of disturbance was not temporary relief. It was the result of a concluded engagement. This is where the situation moved beyond reaction entirely, making the next phase unavoidable and formally initiated. The eighth shift occurred when your status changed without announcement. There was no signal, no confirmation delivered to you, and no external marker. The change did not require acknowledgement from others to take effect. It occurred because the conditions that defined you as a target were no longer valid. Once opposition failed and withdrew, classification had to be updated. You were no longer positioned as a point of pressure. You became a fixed point. A fixed point does not react, does not absorb force, and does not adjust to opposition. It alters the field simply by remaining stable. This reclassification happened automatically because the previous category no longer applied. What cannot be influenced cannot remain listed as vulnerable. This shift altered how all forces interacted with you moving forward. Attention changed, tactics changed, some stopped entirely, others adjusted without explanation. The environment recalibrated around your presence, not because of authority you claimed, but because authority was now assumed. From this point on, movement no longer occurred toward you, it occurred around you. That distinction matters. Once reclassification takes place, former dynamics cannot be restored. The role you occupy now enforces outcomes without effort, and everything that follows proceeds from this updated position. The ninth shift occurred when prediction collapsed. The opposition could no longer anticipate timing, reaction, or outcome. Previous models relied on consistency of response, emotional patterning, and behavioral loops. Those reference points no longer existed. Without predictability, strategy dissolved. What remained was guesswork, and guesswork carries no authority. Attempts to read your movement failed because there was no movement to read. Silence produced no data. Stability produced no signal. The opposition searched for indicators that were no longer being generated. Every effort to forecast resulted in error, and every error compounded loss. The absence of reaction removed the ability to plan. This is where control ended decisively. Influence requires foresight. Without it, pressure becomes blind. The opposition could no longer position itself ahead of you or around you. It was forced into response rather than initiation, and even response arrived too late to matter. From this point forward, advantage was structurally impossible for them. When prediction fails, dominance cannot be sustained. The collapse of forecasting confirmed that the balance had shifted permanently and that all subsequent outcomes would unfold beyond opposition's reach. The 10th shift occurred when internal authority became dominant by default. There was no assertion made and no boundary announced. Authority established itself because nothing external could override it anymore. Decisions no longer required reinforcement. Direction no longer required confirmation. What guided movement came from a fixed internal position that could not be accessed or influenced. This dominance was not expressed outwardly, it was registered through absence. External pressure stopped shaping choices, timing ceased to be negotiated, what once competed for influence found no opening. Authority consolidated quietly because there was no opposing claim that could challenge it. Control did not move inward, it was already there, waiting for interference to end. At this point, commands from outside sources lost relevance entirely. They did not fail through resistance, they failed through irrelevance. When internal authority becomes primary, external inputs lose priority without confrontation. Influence collapses simply by no longer being needed. From here forward, outcomes no longer depended on conditions or reactions. Direction was set internally and carried forward without deviation. This is where sovereignty finalized, making recognition inevitable and ensuring that what follows proceeds under settled control rather than contested influence. The 11th shift occurred when formal acknowledgement took place beyond visibility. This was not a reward and not an elevation ceremony, it was procedural. A review concluded. The conditions that had been met were verified, and the status already operating internally was recognized externally by higher authority. No adjustment was required because alignment was already exact. This acknowledgement did not change your position, it confirmed it. Authority does not announce itself when it is valid, it records. Once recorded, the position becomes enforceable across all levels without further demonstration. What had already stabilized internally was now registered as final and operative. Opposition was aware of this acknowledgement. That awareness mattered more than any confrontation. Once a status is formally recognized, challenge becomes violation rather than resistance. From that moment forward, opposition no longer tested boundaries, it avoided them. Recognition removed ambiguity and replaced it with jurisdiction. This is where the situation moved out of personal experience and into structural reality. What follows is no longer subject to debate or interference. Formal acknowledgement locked the position in place and ensured that every subsequent development would unfold under confirmed authority, making the next phase unavoidable. The 12th shift occurred when the previous cycle sealed completely. What had once repeated no longer reopened. Patterns that relied on return, delay, or reconsideration stopped functioning because the window for revision closed. This was not a gradual fade. It was a definitive endpoint. The system that allowed back-and-forth engagement reached its limit and shut down. Sealing does not announce itself. It removes options. The ability to re-enter old dynamics, revisit prior conflicts, or renegotiate outcomes was no longer available. What had already been decided became fixed by default. The past cycle did not end because it was resolved. It ended because it expired. This closure redirected all remaining pressure away from repetition and toward consequence. Energy that once fueled loops had nowhere to circulate. Attempts to revive old conditions failed immediately because the conditions themselves no longer existed. Closure created a clean break, not through force, but through finality. From this point forward, progression could only move in one direction. The sealed cycle could not be accessed, altered, or reopened. That permanence shifted the entire structure of what followed, ensuring that every next development operated from completion rather than continuation. The 13th shift occurred when pressure relocated away from you without instruction. What had once concentrated directly against your position no longer held there. Resistance did not disappear, it moved. The redistribution was immediate and involuntary, driven by the inability to affect you any further. Pressure always seeks yield. When none is available, it redirects. This redirection exposed a critical imbalance. Forces that once relied on you as a point of engagement were forced to absorb their own output. Strain appeared elsewhere. Systems surrounding the opposition began carrying weight that had previously been projected outward. What you no longer held, they were required to manage themselves. That transfer confirmed where authority now resided. The shift was measurable through absence. You were no longer the site of tension, delay, or disruption. Movement resumed without resistance attached to you. Pressure followed paths of least stability, and you were no longer one of them. That fact alone marked the redistribution as final rather than temporary. From this point forward, engagement could not be recentered on you. The structure no longer supported it. Pressure moving elsewhere confirmed that the reversal was complete and that the environment had reorganized around your fixed position, making the next development unavoidable. The 14th shift occurred when dormant authority activated without instruction. This authority had always existed as capacity, not expression. It did not need to be built or claimed. It required only the removal of interference to come online. Once opposition withdrew and cycles sealed, the authority that had been held in reserve became operational by default. Activation was not a surge or a display. It was alignment snapping into place. Decisions began executing without friction. Movement required no internal debate. Outcomes aligned without effort. What once demanded vigilance now functioned automatically. Authority did not assert itself outwardly because it no longer needed to prove validity. It operated because the conditions now allowed nothing else to override it. This activation coincided precisely with opposition withdrawal because the two are mechanically linked. Dormant authority cannot function while interference remains active. Once interference ended, authority did not need to rise. It simply resumed. That resumption confirmed that the prior resistance was not suppressing potential, but delaying inevitable operation. From this point forward, authority no longer fluctuated. It stabilized as a constant condition. What follows is no longer triggered by challenge or response. It proceeds from an active state that cannot be deactivated, ensuring that every next development unfolds under sustained control rather than temporary dominance. The 15th shift occurred when challenges lost their former weight. What appeared next did not resemble earlier opposition. Intensity diminished, complexity reduced. Obstacles no longer arrived with force or urgency. They presented briefly and resolved without escalation. This change was not due to increased effort on your part. It was the result of authority already being established. Remaining challenges exposed their own limits immediately. They could not build momentum. They could not sustain pressure. Each one surfaced as a formality rather than a confrontation. What once required endurance now required no adjustment. Resistance no longer accumulated. It dissolved on contact with the conditions now in place. This reduction signaled structural weakness, not mercy. When authority is active, challenges lose their ability to compound. They appear isolated and incomplete. The system no longer supports prolonged obstruction. What remains functions as residue rather than opposition. From this point forward, difficulty could no longer define progression. Challenges no longer shaped direction or timing. They passed through without altering outcome. This confirmed that the environment had fully adapted to your position, ensuring that what follows unfolds with increasing inevitability rather than resistance. The 16th shift occurred when aligned forces adjusted without request. There was no signal sent and no coordination initiated. Alignment followed recognition automatically. Once authority stabilized, forces that operate under order responded by repositioning themselves. Support did not announce itself. It became present through consistency and timing rather than intervention. This adjustment was subtle but exact. Pathways opened without negotiation. Delays that had no purpose ceased. Elements that once felt neutral began functioning with precision. Alignment did not create advantage. It removed friction. What had already been authorized internally now moved through an environment that no longer resisted it. These forces did not act out of favor or preference. They responded to structure. When a position is confirmed, alignment follows as a matter of order. The environment recognized what was already settled and adjusted to match it. This was not assistance arriving. It was reality recalibrating. From this point forward, cooperation became implicit rather than requested. Movement no longer required correction. Alignment operating at this level ensured that outcomes would continue unfolding smoothly, making the transition into consequence unavoidable and permanent. The 17th shift occurred when outcomes began triggering on their own. Action was no longer required to initiate movement. Processes that had been delayed activated without prompting. Results emerged as a function of alignment already in place, not effort applied in the moment. Momentum replaced intention, and progression continued without intervention. This automation revealed that the system had fully recalibrated. When outcomes occur without management, authority has already been accepted at every necessary level. Cause no longer needed reinforcement. Effects followed naturally. What once depended on timing, positioning, or resistance now unfolded as sequence. This shift removed uncertainty entirely. When consequence becomes automatic, there is no space left for reversal. Events proceed because they must, not because they are pushed. The environment no longer waits for instruction. It responds to established order. From this point forward, movement could not be paused or redirected. Outcomes were already in motion, carrying forward under their own momentum. This ensured that what follows is not optional, not conditional, and not subject to interruption, making the next stage inevitable. The 18th shift occurred when opposition was confined to observation alone. Action was no longer permitted. Influence was no longer allowed. What remained was awareness without access. The opposing force could see movement, recognize outcome, and register consequence, but it could not interfere. This restriction was not negotiated. It was enforced by the conditions already established. Observation without intervention is the clearest form of limitation. It confirms that boundaries are active and jurisdiction has changed. The opposition did not withdraw completely because withdrawal was no longer relevant. Presence without permission to act carries no authority. Watching replaced resistance because resistance was no longer viable. This confinement exposed the final imbalance. When a force is reduced to awareness, it has already lost agency. Nothing it observes can be altered. Nothing it anticipates can be prevented. The position it once held no longer exists within the operating structure. From this point forward, opposition remains external to outcome. It can register what unfolds, but cannot shape it. This condition confirms that control has fully transferred and that every remaining development proceeds without contest, making stabilization inevitable. The 19th shift occurred when the new role stabilized beyond fluctuation. There was no oscillation between states and no regression into prior dynamics. What had been activated did not require reinforcement to remain active. Stability replaced transition. The position held no longer needed to be defended because it was no longer challenged. This stabilization confirmed legitimacy. Temporary authority requires constant proof. Permanent authority does not. The absence of challenge, adjustment, or correction signaled that the role had settled into its final configuration. The environment responded consistently without testing boundaries or introducing variance. Predictability returned, but this time it operated in your favor. Once stabilized, the role enforced itself. It shaped interaction, timing, and outcome without effort. Nothing external attempted to recalibrate it because recalibration was no longer possible. The structure had accepted the position as fixed. From this point forward, the situation could not revert. Stability eliminated the possibility of disruption. What remains now is continuation under settled conditions, ensuring that the final outcome unfolds without interruption or deviation. The 20th shift occurred when irreversibility became absolute. There was no remaining path backward, no mechanism for reversal, and no authority capable of contesting the outcome. What happened could not be undone because it was not an action taken in the moment. It was the consequence of a sequence completing exactly as required. The step back was final because the structure that allowed forward pressure no longer existed. This outcome was not symbolic or psychological, it was operational. Once the opposition stepped back, it forfeited position permanently. Re-entry would require conditions that no longer exist and authority that is no longer granted. The withdrawal did not pause the process, it concluded it. From that point on, the future began unfolding from a new baseline that cannot be lowered or challenged. What now unfolds does so without resistance, because resistance has already been resolved. There is no remaining conflict to address and no threshold left to cross. Everything moving forward is consequence, not trial. The event has already been finalized. This is the point of no return. The devil stepped back, and that movement locked the outcome in place. What follows is not escalation, it is execution. What needed to be decided has already been decided. Your position is no longer under review. The outcome is fixed, and the authority behind it is settled. You are recognized by what you upheld when pressure failed to move you. You are identified by restraint that held, by integrity that did not bend, and by silence that carried weight. That identity is active now, not assigned later. Status follows structure, and your structure is already confirmed. The environment is already responding to this recognition. Adjustments are occurring without announcement. Paths are aligning without negotiation. Opposition no longer engages because engagement is no longer permitted. What unfolds does so as consequence, not possibility. Affirmation: I stand confirmed and unmoved. Comment this affirmation with certainty. Like, share, subscribe, and comment to remain aligned and continue receiving confirmation as it unfolds. This is Wisdom Sign. The position is set.